please welcome Dr. Jessica Barker.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming to see my keynote this morning, where I'm talking primarily about the psychology of fear. I'm really delighted to be here at RSA, keynoting, particularly in a year when we're focusing on the human element, because I'm sure, like a lot of you, that's my passion, so it feels amazing to be able to speak on this stage about that today. So, what I'm speaking about today, I've always specialized in awareness, behavior, and culture when it comes to cybersecurity. And so what I'm talking about today is some lessons from my experience and a lot from scientific research that helps us understand how we can communicate cybersecurity messages in the most effective way. And when I say communicate, who am I talking about we're communicating to? Primarily, I'm talking about communicating with the end users, people who don't work in security, maybe not in technology, and people who we're desperately trying to reach with our awareness raising, trying to promote more positive behaviors when it comes to security. So I'm going to be speaking about what fear has to do with this and why we need a good understanding of the psychology of fear when we're communicating cybersecurity messages. I'm going to be talking about something called fear appeals, what they mean, and particularly what they mean when it comes to cybersecurity communications. I'm going to be talking about how we can communicate a scary subject in the most constructive and responsible way. When I first started exploring the psychology of fear in relation to cybersecurity about 5 years ago, I did it because I was doing a lot of awareness raising, I still do. But at the time I wondered, can I talk about this subject and not scare people? And I quickly sort of realized you can't talk about cybersecurity and not elicit some sense of fear among the people you're talking to. Inherently, we are always going to be speaking to some extent about threats. So what I then became interested in is how can we do that in a way that is the most constructive, is going to have the most positive impact, and is the most responsible, because we're dealing with an emotion when it comes to fear. And then for the end of my presentation, I'm going to be looking at how we can move beyond fear. So firstly, how do we use fear and how do we use fear responsibly? But then what else can we use? What other emotional appeals can we draw on? So throughout this presentation, I will be drawing on psychology, sociology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, all these fields that really help us understand people much better so that we can really put people at the heart of our security communications. So, why speak about fear and cybersecurity? We know from behavioral economics that people are more scared of things if they feel like they don't understand them, or if they feel like that subject, that topic, that issue is out of control. And this is why, for example, people are more likely to be afraid of air travel than driving in their car, because it feels out of control and it involves a lot of technology that they're not familiar with. They're not the one usually piloting the plane, so it feels unfamiliar, it feels out of control. So even though there are way more car accidents than there are plane accidents, people are disproportionately afraid, or more likely to be afraid, of flying in a plane. What has this got to do with cybersecurity? Well, of course, what we see in cybersecurity has been a huge rise in number of public attacks. We see cybersecurity issues hitting the headlines pretty much on a daily basis. And on one level, this is good for awareness, isn't it? It means our board members are more likely to be thinking and asking about cybersecurity. It maybe warms people up in our organizations, our colleagues, to cybersecurity awareness. It brings the topic to the front of people's minds. So that's great, except that's a double-sided coin, and it can mean that people feel like cybersecurity is out of control. There are so many breaches and hacks happening all the time, even to tech-savvy companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google. So if it's happening to them, well, it must be huge. It must be out of control. What chance do we have? And security can feel very unfamiliar for a lot of people as well. We often talk in a technical language. We often use terms that might not make sense to people outside of the industry. Even in mainstream news coverage, sometimes it's not that clear to the average person what has happened and what's being spoken about and what it means to them. So unfamiliar and out of control, which means that when we go in to do our awareness raising, we have to understand that cybersecurity is one of these issues that people potentially have a disproportionate level of fear about. So I've talked about fear a little bit already. What do I mean by fear? Well, fear, of course, is an emotion. Fear is not the danger, it's not the issue, it's not the threat, it's our emotional response to it. And there's been a great deal of research in psychology, in sociology, in other human-centered disciplines as to what fear actually means and how we respond to it. On the surface level, we can think fear is just a thing, it just exists, it's the same wherever you go, whoever you are. But of course, that's absolutely not the case. A sociologist called Tudor has done a great deal of work trying to understand how fear manifests itself in society and what this means. And so we can look at an example that Tudor uses about a tiger. Tigers are scary, right? We're all going to be scared of a tiger. Well, if we're alone in the jungle and we come across a tiger, then yeah, we're going to be pretty scared, I would have thought, most of us. I know I would be. I'm not trained in tiger handling, so that's going to be quite scary to me. If I am in a group, a safari group, and there is a safari leader there who is trained in tracking tigers, has the right equipment in case something goes wrong, knows what to do if the tiger is showing signs of attacking, knows what signs of attack look like, well, then I'm going to feel much more confident and much less afraid than if I'm just on my own. If I'm that trained safari leader, well, then I'm going to feel even more confident again. I'm going to have to recognize that I'm responsible for the group that's with me, that they've put their trust in me, and that I'm playing this role, this intermediary between the tiger and the people that I'm shepherding. If I'm a hunter and I see a tiger, I'm going to feel entirely differently again. I'm unlikely to feel afraid. I'm going to feel excited because, there's my fortune. That's what I've been searching. That's what I'm here to do. If I see a tiger on the TV, I'm at home with a cup of tea and I'm watching a documentary, well, I'm not going to feel afraid at all. So depending on who you are in relation to the tiger, you're going to feel very differently. And of course, this is the same with technology and cyber insecurity. In the example that I gave, I see us as the safari leaders. We're the ones who are trained, we're the ones that know what attacks look like, what signs of attack look like, and we are responsible for the people that we are shepherding. But we have to understand that they are going to have a different emotional response to the tiger, the technology, the cyber insecurity than we are. So in my introduction, I mentioned fear appeals. Fear appeals, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a message that tries to change behavior by using a fear-based message. So I'm using something scary to try and influence you to change your behavior. And so, for example, we see fear appeals on the TV, don't drink and drive. We see fear appeals on cigarette packets, warning us of the health dangers of smoking. We see fear appeals every day, all around us. And we've been using them in society for many decades to try to encourage more positive behaviors in all sorts of areas of life. Now, psychologists have taken these decades and decades of work around fear appeals to analyze how come some of these work and how come some of them don't. Because some are very successful in changing behaviors, and some not even don't work, they can actually make the problem worse. They can drive more negative behaviors. So psychologists have been looking at why some work, why some don't, and what key messages we can take from those. Now, when I talk about the psychology of fear, I often get this question, and it might be something you're all thinking at RSA. Surely it's very straightforward. Social engineers use fear all the time in their phishing, smishing, vishing messages, and they tend to work. So isn't it straightforward? Isn't it easy? If they're doing it, why can't we do it as well? And it's a very good question. The research shows that if you are trying to promote, trying to encourage, trying to elicit a knee-jerk, immediate reaction, then fear works. So perfect for a phishing email. You can scare someone into what behavioral economics call a hot state, basically the thinking fast part of the brain. You can encourage someone to get into that clouded emotional state where they'll react really quickly without thinking it through. So for an immediate reaction, fear is good. If you're trying to encourage long-term behavioral change, it becomes much more complicated. And this is why social engineers, cyber criminals, can use fear really very effectively in their attacks, but we need to be much more intelligent and considered when we're using fear-based messaging ourselves. So one of the most fundamental pieces of research around fear and fear appeals was conducted by a psychologist called Leventhal. And Leventhal had been charged with looking at trying to increase the rate of tetanus vaccination. So Leventhal was given this challenge. People, particularly in the US, some decades ago, weren't getting the tetanus vaccine, even though it was a pretty simple thing to do, and it was proven to be very effective. So Leventhal was asked to look into this and to try to drive the rate of people having the tetanus vaccine. So Leventhal and his teams took groups of students and they tried to scare them into getting the vaccine. They showed them horrible images, described the symptoms of tetanus in great detail, and really tried to encourage people to go and get the vaccine. They found that scaring people really didn't work. People left the sessions saying, I'm really scared, I'm going to do something about it, I'm going to go and get the vaccine. Almost 100% of people said that. Less than 1% actually went and got the vaccine. So simply scaring people wasn't working. They took other groups of students, they used the same fear-based messaging, but then they gave them lots of tools to go and get the vaccine. So a researcher sat down with these students, they gave them a map of the campus, they pointed out where they were, where the experiments were taking place, they showed them where the health center was, they gave them the opening times of the health center, they asked where they lived and helped them map a route. You know, how are you going to get to the health center to get the vaccine? When are you going to go? When are you going to make an appointment? So they really gave the individuals the tools to go and get the vaccine. They checked back with these groups some weeks later, and of course compliance wasn't 100%, but out of everyone that said they would have the vaccine, which was about 100%, 30% of people did. So compared to that 1%, much more effective when people actually were given the tools and the roadmap of how they could go and get the vaccine. So based on Leventhal's work, there was a lot more research done into fear appeals, when they work and when they don't. And it's led to this, the extended parallel process model. Psychologists have produced this to help explain how to create a fear appeal that is more likely to be effective. And this really illustrates how we react when we're confronted with a fear-based message. We won't even be aware that we're reacting like this, but this is how we process a fear-based message. So if someone comes to me and they tell me something scary to try and change my behavior, the first thing that I will do is appraise the threat. I will decide, is that threat real? Are there cyber criminals out there hacking people, stealing data? I think we're at a point where most people would agree, yes. So people appraise that threat and they would probably be convinced, yes, the threat of cyber insecurity is real. What we then do is we Consider our susceptibility. So we have to be convinced not only that the threat is real, but that it applies to us. And if people feel like, yeah, there's criminal hackers out there stealing data, but why would they want my data? If they feel like that, if they feel like they would not be targeted or caught up in cybercrime, we've lost them. So according to this model, we have to convince people the threat is real and, crucially, that it applies to them. They have to feel that they are susceptible to the threat. Then the most important message that has to come through is the efficacy. People will go on from thinking, is the threat real? Does it apply to me? Is there something that I can do about it? And will that work? So people will appraise the efficacy of the message if it's having better passwords. Is it going to improve my security to have better passwords? Is that going to work? Is that something I have the time, the ability, the knowledge, and the tools to do? And people have to feel that they can do it and that it will be successful for them to actually engage in our fear-based message. Otherwise, they will just engage with the emotion. So if we convince them the threat is real, it applies to them, there is something they can do about it, it will work, and they're capable of it, then they will engage in controlling the actual danger. So then they will engage with the behaviors we're encouraging. If we lose them at any point in this model, at any point on that journey, they will just engage with the fear, the emotion. And that means they'll find a way of avoiding what we're recommending. They will either switch off from listening to us, they will become tired, their eyes will glaze over, they'll think, well, it doesn't apply to me, or, what's the point? It's so bad anyway. There's no way that I can, if Google's being hacked, then what chance do I have? Or they'll think this person, they're just trying to sell me something. They've got an agenda. I don't need to listen to this. Or at the other end of the scale, which I have seen happen, they'll become so terrified that they won't want to go on the internet. They won't want to open any of their emails. They won't want to click on any links. So one way or another, they're engaging with the emotional response, not the true danger. So usually they'll engage with avoidance, reactance, doubt. One way or another, they will convince themselves emotionally that what we're saying doesn't apply to them. So what we really need to do with our fear-based messaging is make it relevant to the people, the individual people that we're speaking to, and we really need to empower them. We really need them to feel that they can engage with the responses we're recommending. And I'm going to encourage a few ways that we can do that in my next few slides. One of those ways is to think about all of the messages that we share with people. It becomes really difficult for an end user to engage in our recommendations if they're, a really long list. If we're telling people 10, 20, 100 things that they need to do, that is so overwhelming, there's no way they're going to engage with what we recommend. So we really need to think about how we can reduce the noise and focus on the signal for people. If you have 3, 4, 5 maximum key messages that you can focus on with your end users or your kids or a media message, what are your top priorities? And the best way of doing this is really to think about your risk assessments. What is it in your organization that is most risky concerning your end users? Those are the messages you want to focus on. You can't overwhelm them with everything at once. You have to pick your priorities. And then you change 1, 2 behaviors at a time, and you keep building upon that. Another really important issue when it comes to efficacy is making sure people have the tools for the job. And this is a really big pet hate of mine when we do awareness raising, but we don't give anyone a solution to engage with. So for example, classic one, of course, is passwords. We will tell people they need to have a strong, unique password for all of their accounts. They've got how many accounts? According to some research, 30. According to other research, over 100. I've lost track of how many accounts I've got. I have no idea. But if we tell them they need to have a strong, unique password for all of their accounts, we have to tell them how they're going to manage that. We can't expect them to just remember those because the cognitive load is way too high. Nobody can do that. And if we as security professionals are recommending to people that they do it, we have to ask ourselves, are we really doing that? We are either using a password manager, great, writing them down, that's okay in some scenarios, or we're reusing weaker passwords. If we can't do it, we can't ask them to. So if you're in an organization that is doing awareness raising about passwords, but doesn't have an enterprise-level password management tool and isn't rolling that out with good workshops, you're asking people to do the impossible, and they're going to switch off, not just from that message, but potentially from other security messages as well. And then what we really need to do is make sure people feel empowered, that they feel confident. This is one of the big issues I see when I do awareness raising in clients, is people feel intimidated by technology in general often, but also really by security. They feel like they don't want to ask the stupid question. They feel like if they get something wrong, the finger's going to be pointed at them, they're going to be blamed, they're maybe going to be laughed at. So people do not feel psychologically safe when it comes to security in their organization. So we need to encourage people to feel confident and also to feel intrinsically motivated to engage in security, because that's really the only way we can get them to long-term change their behaviors. How do we do that? One of the key things, from my point of view, is to shift our messaging. We generally, in security, understandably, we're quite negative. We generally are quite pessimistic with our messaging. And of course we are, because we're usually dealing with a negative. We're dealing with threats. But the problem with that is that people are far more likely to engage with a positive message than a negative one. So if we keep hammering the negative messages and questioning why people aren't engaging with them, we need to think about how people respond to messages and whether we can actually change our messaging to be more effective. People are far more likely to engage with a positive message, and we see this all the time on social media. This is why we love the likes and the retweets and all of the positivity that we get when someone engages with a post, because it triggers that dopamine hit in our brain that we don't get from a negative message. So how do we do this in security? Well, partly it's about not just punishing bad behaviors, but more importantly, looking at how we can positively reinforce good behaviors. So how can we reward people when they engage in security in a positive way, rather than just waiting for people to make mistakes and punishing them? And the importance of being positive ties in with the optimism bias. So there's been research conducted by neuroscientists led by Dr. Tali Sharot, and this research has been conducted around the world to look into whether we approach our futures in a positive or a negative way. And what the researchers have found over the last 10 years is that the vast majority of people, about 80% of people, are wired towards optimism in our own personal lives. So we might think the world around us is getting worse, but me, I am going to be just fine. And this optimism bias persists regardless of geography, of gender, of ethnicity, of socioeconomic status. Regardless of any demographic factor, most people are wired towards optimism about their own future. This is why people prefer, in general, Fridays to Sundays. We love that feeling when we're at work on a Friday, thinking about our day off on Sunday more than we actually enjoy that day off on Sunday, because we're optimistic. What has this got to do with cybersecurity? Well, the research shows that optimism persists in the face of statistics. So you can talk to people about negative facts. You can tell people how many hacks are taking place, how much money it's costing, how it can target or damage them. And people will think, yeah, that might be happening to everyone around me, but me, I'm going to be just fine. It's like if you ask someone on their wedding day what the rate of divorce is. People know that a good proportion of marriages end in divorce. Do you think your marriage is going to end in divorce? How many people on their wedding day would think it would? Nobody does, because it doesn't happen to me. Why would hackers want my data? And so, for example, from this research by Sharot and her team, they asked people how likely they thought they were of getting a terrible disease like cancer. And the average response was, about 10% maybe. So the researchers said to them, well, unfortunately, we all have a statistical likelihood of 30% of developing cancer in our lifetime. Now you have that fact, how likely do you think you are of developing cancer? Maybe 11%? People don't think it's going to happen to them. So if we keep trying to use facts, negative facts, to drive our awareness raising, unfortunately, it's going to keep falling flat because it doesn't convince the individuals that it relates to them. So that sounds like quite a pessimistic message, ironically. But the good news, and it's so obvious, but the research supports it. The good news is that optimism makes people try harder. If you give people an optimistic message, of course, they are far more likely to engage in it than a negative message. If you can tell someone, the sky's falling in, cybersecurity's terrible, everyone's getting hacked, oh, but make sure you change your password. Why would somebody bother? If you tell them cybersecurity's real and it relates to you, but you can engage in these few quite simple behaviors to make your resistance to the threat, 95, 98%, avoid that threat to such a high level, well, that's an optimistic message that people are far more likely to engage in. So this goes back really to the fear appeal research. Giving a strong efficacy message is far more likely to be successful. Another tool that I find is really engaging when it comes to scaling up awareness raising and when it comes to changing behaviors in an organization is social proof. Social proof can really help to amplify our messages. So again, psychology shows us that if we as humans don't know what to do, we will mimic the behaviors of other people. This is what TripAdvisor, Airbnb, Google reviews, all of these things are based on, social proof. And researchers have even put a statistic to it. So I think it was the University of Pennsylvania recently did some studies, and they found that if 25% of a group acts in a certain way, the rest of the group will follow. 25% is about that tipping point. So if 25% of you get up and leave now, I'm going to be talking to myself. Or more likely, I'm going to follow because we think other people know better. So we think, oh, that 25%, they must have heard a fire alarm, or they must have seen the schedule and know that she's talking too long, or they must have decided this is rubbish, so it must be rubbish, so I'm going to leave as well. We put our trust in a good number of other people behaving in a certain way, thinking, good enough for them, good enough for me. Think for a minute about social proof and cybersecurity. Because when I look at a lot of cybersecurity messages, what I see is us shooting ourselves in the foot. For example, we try and do awareness raising where we tell everyone how many bad passwords there are out there on the internet. And we think we're scaring people into looking and saying, what? There's that many people using password 1 as a password? That's ridiculous. Instead, according to social proof, what we're doing is we're saying, everyone else is using a terrible password, so you don't need to worry about it. So people hear this message, they hear the fact that there's loads of people using weak passwords out there, and they think, sweet, I'm fine. Everyone else is using a bad password. There's no need for me to change either. So how can we use social proof to our advantage? Well, if you're in an organization that does phishing simulations, perhaps you communicate the rate of people that click on the link. So most communications go along the lines of, we did a phishing simulation and 20% of people clicked the link. That's really bad. Do better next time. According to social proof, we would be way more effective if we said, we did a phishing simulation, 80% of people did not click the link. That is fantastic. Next time, if you're in that 20%, join the majority of your colleagues and keep our organizations safe. That's an empowering message, that's an engaging message, and that's a message that builds on social proof. I always think this is a very funny story when it comes to social proof. Has anybody heard about the shed in Dulwich in London? So this was a journalist who wanted to see whether he could turn his garden shed, does that translate to a US audience, a shed? Yes, thank you. Wanted to turn his garden shed on TripAdvisor into a restaurant. His shed was not a restaurant. It was full of the usual things that sheds are full of. But he put it up on TripAdvisor, and he got a few people to do some reviews, and he basically used social proof on TripAdvisor to end up getting his shed as the top-rated restaurant in his area, despite never having served any food. So that's funny enough, but what he then decided to do was actually open the shed one night for dinner. He was getting calls, people trying to book into his shed, and he's saying, I'm really sorry, we're booked up for the next 6 months. That's fine, I'll book in 6 months' time. So they opened up the shed, and he got some microwave meals, and people booked tables, and they went and they were served these microwave meals, and because of social proof, they went away saying, that was the best meal I've ever had. Can we come back next year for my big birthday? And gave amazing reviews on TripAdvisor. All because they had been primed to think that the shed in Dulwich was the best place they could eat. So I love that example about social proof because it shows the power of social proof, but also because it's funny. And I love whenever you can get a chance to be funny, particularly when talking about cybersecurity. People don't really expect us to be funny. People come into awareness raising thinking it's going to be dry, it's going to be boring, and there's so many funny things we can talk about. And it's good to be funny because research shows that a funny or a weird message is more memorable. People are more likely to go away and remember that. However, just like fear, using humor comes with a warning. We have to understand that there are different ways that you can use these emotions to be effective, but that if you don't know what you're doing, they can actually backfire on you. So, speaking of humor, the CDC campaign about the zombie apocalypse. CDC wanted to do a big campaign about pandemics, and they chose the zombie apocalypse kind of analogy to encourage people to prep like a go bag of all the stuff that they would need. And they were delighted, as any awareness professional would be, to see this campaign go viral. People loved it. They thought it was hilarious. They were sharing it on social media. They were watching it. They were talking about it. So the CDC built on this. They did more and more communications around this theme. Absolutely brilliant. What they didn't do, though, is check whether it was having the intended result in terms of behavior. So some researchers did then look into it. They looked into whether this humorous campaign was actually driving positive behavior. And they found that when they compared people who had seen the CDC zombie campaign with people who hadn't, that actually the people who hadn't seen it were more likely to be prepared for a zombie apocalypse than the people who had. And the researchers concluded that basically the humor of the message, unfortunately, undermined the efficacy. So people thought it was so funny that it couldn't be real. So they didn't take it seriously, and they didn't engage in the behaviors that the CDC actually wanted to drive. So it's a really good example of the fact that awareness does not always lead to behaviors, or the behaviors that we want. And another example of that would be the Got Milk campaign. I mean, everybody knows this slogan, right? Surely that's a successful awareness campaign. It was extremely popular. But throughout the use of the campaign, milk consumption kept declining. People loved the campaign, but they weren't drinking more milk. They were drinking less milk. So the milk industry realized that they had to do something about it. They did a lot of research to look into this. And they found that it just wasn't engaging people to actually change their behaviors and how they felt about drinking milk. And they discovered a few things that would change those behaviors, and that did. One was to focus on the protein level of milk, because people generally want to consume more protein now. One was to have a partnership with McDonald's, where you could get milk as part of the Happy Meal. And the other was to change the shape of milk containers, which were always that kind of square one, and to make some round so they can go in your car cup container. So we can't just think about awareness. We have to test our messages to see if they land right, if they hit the points we want to in terms of changing behavior. Because as that Got Milk campaign clearly shows, it is not just about awareness. We can't just focus on raising awareness. We have to think about whether we're making our security usable, whether people are going away from our campaigns and actually engaging in the behaviors we recommend. And again, it comes back to that fear appeal point of efficacy. People have to have the tools to engage in. We have to build the security around them. And the aviation industry gives a fantastic example of this. Since the 1950s, accidents in the aviation industry have rapidly declined, so they have a really low level of incidents. This has partly been technological because of the introduction of the jet engine, but it's also very much human-based. The 1950s is when the aviation industry started to put people at the center. So they started to look at how the pilots and how the crew engaged in technology, and then they created that technology around them. They also introduced a just culture, so a culture that moved away from blaming individuals for incidents. When an incident happens in the aviation industry, it's not about pointing the finger, it's about looking at that incident very openly so that you can see what's happened. How can we stop it happening again? The aviation industry understood that a fear-based culture, a culture that blames people for incidents, does not reduce the number of incidents. It just reduces the number of reports of incidents, which is the last thing that we want in security. If we have a blame culture, a fear culture, then people don't make less mistakes when it comes to information and technology. They just don't tell us about them. And we in this room all know that that's the last thing we want. If someone is at the center of an incident and they keep it quiet, it just means we have less time to act on it, to investigate, to remediate. So we really need to be thinking, not just about awareness, not just about behavior, but about culture. What kind of culture do we want in security? What kind of security culture do you have in your organization? Do you measure that culture? Do you have metrics in place to tell you whether that culture is moving in the direction you want it to? Do you know what behaviors would make up the kind of culture you want? And how do you raise awareness that is targeted at those behaviors? We really need to start thinking about our culture, both in our organizations and the kind of security culture that we have in general. What is the culture of our profession? Because these are the things that really influence us as individuals, as teams, as organizations, but also really influences the people that we're trying to engage with. So I'm going to wrap up my presentation now with some time for questions, but I just wanted to give you the takeaways before I do. One of the key things that I have hoped to convey today is that when you're talking about something scary, which we often are when it comes to security, we really need to focus on the efficacy of our message. Too much in the past, we've gone very heavy on the threat, and we've thought if we just talk enough about the threat, we can scare people into behaving as we want. We need to move away from that approach and focus much more on empowering people. How we do that is reducing the noise so that people can really engage with our most important messages. We can harness the optimism bias and social proof to drive more positive behaviors and drive a more positive culture. We absolutely have to provide people with the tools. If you're doing an awareness message, but you don't have a tool that people can engage with, you don't have a way that people can go and implement your message, then I'd encourage you to take a step back and ask whether what you're asking of people is really realistic. And really underpinning all of this is harnessing a more positive culture in cybersecurity so that people in our organizations feel they can come to us with an incident, with a question, with a concern, and so that we can have the kind of culture that actually looks at incidents without blaming people and means we're far more likely to increase the reporting. So thank you so much for your time, for your attention. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you all today. I'm at RSA for the rest of the week, so I'd be delighted to chat with anyone over the coming days. You can find me on Twitter. You can go and check out our website and our blog, where there's lots of my work and the work of my colleagues. But in the meantime, if anyone has a question now, I'd be very happy to take it. We have a question here. I think there's a mic coming. If we can just... sorry, so if you can come to the mic. Thank you. I'm going to grab some water while you do.
Hi, my name's Zach Etienne with Clements Worldwide.
Hi.
And my question is, how can an organization leverage social proof when mitigating reputational harm after a data breach?
Yep, so social proof, particularly mitigating after a data breach. So any positive lessons you can take from a data breach, you know, that this incident was reported to us, this is how the team responded to it, this is what technology we've put in place, this is what we're doing to build on it. So any positive messages you can draw, particularly around how people behaved, that was key to help you responding to that incident, I would really encourage. When it comes to social proof in general, I find one of the most important or one of the most successful mechanisms is a champions program, sometimes called champions, ambassadors, whatever it might be, but people in an organization who aren't security professionals, but they take on the role a bit like health and safety, where they become like a security rep in their area of the business. They're not expected to become an expert, but they maybe get a little bit of training and they have a route into security. And having a champions network can be great for getting your messaging out, but also providing that kind of social proof of having people dotted throughout the business. And that can be really helpful, both in responding to an incident, because they may feed back issues quicker than would otherwise happen, but also in feeding out what's happened after an incident. Your champions can go to their teams and say, this is what's happened, these are the good things we can take from it, and this is what we're implementing so that it doesn't happen again or so that we're better protected. Thank you for your question. Hi.
Hi. You talked a lot about empowerment. Definitely agree. What do you think about repeat offenders, people that are doing things that are clearly, it's not just an accident, or it's an accident, but it's the third and fourth and the fifth time. Sure. So where do you think accountability comes within an organization?
Yeah, repeat offenders are a problem. When it comes to repeat offenders, I usually find there is something beneath that. And it can be that they just don't understand what they're supposed to do. And we may feel like, well, we've delivered the training, everyone else understands it, why don't they? But as an individual, worth exploring whether there is a blocker like that they just don't understand or they can't use the technology. Another issue can go beyond security, and it can be that they're not happy in their job, that there's something wrong at home. It can be all these things that unfortunately we know in security can have such an impact on our field, but we don't necessarily have control over. So then I would encourage conversations with HR, with their line management. I would always encourage having a positive and empowering approach for as long as possible until it becomes to the point where someone is obviously, being willfully negligent or is actually being malicious. Of course, there has to be some repercussion on people when it gets to that stage, but I do find the majority of people don't fall into that particular category. Thank you.
So I think these concepts are amazing for creating awareness campaigns within a company, but I'm wondering from an industry perspective or industry level, specifically in healthcare where I'm from, we have 58% of data breaches come from insiders.
Yep.
We're the only critical infrastructure where you're more likely to be breached by your or compromised by your internal people. So how do we use these concepts to create awareness in an entire industry? Do you do it at the individual company level and hope it percolates up, or is there some larger awareness campaign?
That's a really good question. I think that obviously that insider problem is prevalent, but of course there are industries where it's more of an issue. And I would say that is a mixture. If you can work on an individual organizational basis, then fantastic. But also trying to work on the culture of the whole industry. So whether that's at industry events, whether that is trying to have some kind of consortium across the industry, anything that you can do to try and impact the culture in general, and then trying to build it up in organizations as well.
Hello.
Hi.
So you talked a lot about how to engage users. My sort of bigger issue is how to engage my management and the executives, and I wonder how you might tailor your message to be able to deliver it to people who are in a decision-making position.
Sure. I get that question a lot, and I also do a lot of work with executives. I do find that social proof is really impactful for executives. So one of the most common questions that I get from boards is, how do we compare to other organizations? So if you can make it relevant to them by showing what other organizations are doing, how other organizations have been impacted by the threat, any organization that they relate to that's in the same sector that they compete with, then fantastic. I also find that efficacy with executives is really important. They don't want to hear just about problems. They want to know very quickly, what can we do about it? So always kind of going in with a plan of what you want from them, what they can do. And the other thing that I have found very effective with executives is, again, kind of goes back to social proof. Sometimes, for example, if you've got to present to the board and you've got 15 minutes, half an hour maybe, it's very hard to persuade them in that time. So you need to do like a pincer movement in the run-up to that meeting. And you basically want to get people who are around that table on your side before you go in. So whether that's trying to directly grab one of them for coffee in the weeks beforehand, someone who's been a bit sympathetic to the cause before, trying to get them to be a champion for you in the room is going to be the most effective way. Or maybe you have to, it depends on the organization and the hierarchy, but maybe you have to go up through the levels to get to that individual or those couple of individuals who, when you are voicing your concerns and what you want, they're going to be sat around the table influencing their peers, saying, you know what, he's right, we need to do this, I'm fully on board with it. And then it provides that social proof for the other board members. Hope it helps.
Yes, hello. There's a point where I look at cyber at the beginning was the objective was to create the fear to get the people to understand there was a problem. There's a crossover point. We know fear is the false evidence appearing real, so we have a situation where we're now past the point of, let's say we understand that the ones who make big decisions understand this is a problem. You're saying we're at that point, these are the techniques you use beyond that. But what would you do before that? To say, I look at the climate change, they use symbol at that same point. So I'm just trying to understand a little bit, how would you get before that? Because there's still pockets where people don't understand that. We had other discussions this morning where millennials are actually more susceptible to being attacked than, let's say, other folks who've been in that a lot longer. So just to hear your point.
Sure. So what you're saying is, are there some groups of people where this approach doesn't work? We need to kind of take it back a level. I don't really think so. I think it's the research shows, and I have found, it's never successful to go heavy on the fear. And if you think back to what we've been doing over the last few decades, I think the proof is in the pudding. Like, we haven't been successful in just hammering the fear. So I would say, whatever level of awareness a group has, of course you need to get them to understand the threat and that it's susceptible to them, but then you need them to feel empowered, otherwise they just won't switch on to the message.
So you talked about moving away from a culture of blaming the end user,
Sure.
right, and having more kind of an open culture. What I'm struggling with is, where do you draw the line between consequence management and having that open culture to make sure that you have some governance
Sure.
within place, so you distinguish between someone who's intentionally doing something and someone
Yeah.
doing it, through a mistake or something, of that nature?
Yep, of course, it has to be balanced. One thing I do find, though, is an empowering and positive security culture tends to be more beneficial in that kind of malicious insider threat as well, partly because if everybody is feeling engaged in security and if everyone is practicing more positive behaviors, those that willfully are not stand out so much more. So it actually, and people then care about that, and they're more likely to say, hey, Jess is being a little bit strange with how much she's downloading, like, I don't know, maybe you want to look at that. So the more positive culture, I think, actually has a positive impact on malicious insiders. As I said earlier, of course, a positive approach has to be balanced with some consequences for people who are willfully negligent or malicious. But we can't keep treating everyone who makes a mistake as if they should be punished. Thank you, and that is time. So thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.